that. So we're recording now, and I'll chat a bit about what we'll be talking about for the next little bit. So we'll start things off about Muskoka Conservancy, some background information, an update if it's been a while since you've attended an event like this. We'll jump right into what is a bat after that, go through different types and groups of bats, some common misconceptions. We'll look specifically at Ontario's bats, which are all found in Muskoka. We'll talk about threats to bats and how you can help. And my favorite slide, which I like to call cool bats and cool facts, where we'll talk about some other cool information, and then we'll have that period for questions. So next slide, where are we? There we go. Next slide, there we go. So about Muskoka Conservancy, we are the Land Trust of Muskoka, and we are a registered charity. We were established in 1987. And our mission is to conserve and protect the nature of Muskoka. And we do this by physically acquiring land, which is then protected in perpetuity for all of our future generations. So the way we protect land is by physically acquiring land. We acquire land through donations. So generous members of the community will donate their land to us. We'll also have community members raise funds for us to be able to purchase land for protection. And more recently, we've been able to get grants or other sources of funding from different foundations to purchase land as well. So as of 2023, we are now protecting 52 different properties across the Muskoka region. This is adding up to almost 4,000 acres of land. We're getting very, very close to 4,000. About 60,000 feet of sensitive shoreline on a lot of our major large lakes like Lake Muskoka and Lake Joseph, as well as some of our smaller but also very important lakes as well as over 700 acres of wetland. So by protecting these areas, we are protecting these resources and areas for enjoyment for future generations, as well as for all of Muskoka's flora and fauna as well, including many species at risk. Their numbers are especially in decline. So we're very proud to be protecting these areas for us, as well as for the wildlife that call them home. In addition to land conservation, we also run a series of guided hikes as a part of our Nature Quest series and program. So you may have been on one of those before or heard of them before. We like to run those on a monthly basis. And I always like to mention as well that as a charity, we rely on donations to continue our operations, as well as an amazing, amazing group of volunteers that will come out to help us monitor lands. They will spearhead different projects and programs or help us fight invasive species in the marsh. So if you're interested in anything like that or becoming a member, you can always give us a call or send us an email. And I do have my information in the last slide if you'd like to jot that down then. So with all of that background about the Conservancy, we'll jump right into bats. So the first question is, what is a bat? So oftentimes there can be a lot of confusion about what a bat actually is. So do you guys think they belong to the rodent family? Feel free to put in the chat or unmute yourselves as well. Do you think they're a rodent, like a rat or a mouse or a beaver or something like that? What do you guys think? No one's too sure. Okay, so I'll give you this one to you. No, they're not a rodent. So even though they look like a rat or like a mouse, they're fuzzy like them. One main thing that can help you figure out and determine that they're not a mouse or a rodent is that they don't have those teeth that are very characteristic of a rodent. So those sort of two sets of incisors that are quite sharp for chewing through wood because they're herbivores, but no bats do not have rodent teeth. Do you think they're a type of hairy bird, that they do fly around like a bird? Do you guys think they belong to that family? Alan says no. You're right. Yep. Donna says no. Definitely not a bird. Although they fly around like birds, that's about where the similarities stop. They don't have a beak like birds, and overall, they're very different. So the group that they belong to is mammal group. So they're very similar to us in a lot of their makeup. But I always like to bring everyone back in a lot of my presentations to biology class, where you think about the taxonomic groupings of animals, where it starts with the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then eventually you get to species. So the class is mammal that they belong to, and then the order that makes bats unique is the Chiroptera order that they belong to. So they share a lot of similar features to us as mammals. They have hair like us. They give birth to live young. You can see a little one on the bat that's on the left side of the screen. They've got a little baby hanging onto them there. And they also produce milk to feed their young as well. But over the next couple of slides, there we go. We'll go into a bit more specifics about what makes bats unique as a part of the Chiroptera order. So, as mentioned, they are mammals, but they're the only mammal that has the ability to fly. So you won't see any other mammals, you won't see humans around flying, not on their own anyways. You might see them in planes flying, but that's different. Their name, Chiroptera, when translated from Latin, means hand wing. So the bones that make up a bat's wing is actually comprised of the same exact bones that we have as humans, as mammals, in our arms and hands as well. But they just have specialized tissue that connects them so that they can fly. They do have a fairly long lifespan, over 30 years, sometimes up into 40 years. They're able to live quite a long life. They also have very good eyesight. So oftentimes people think that, you've heard the saying blind as a bat, because they rely so much on echolocation, and they do have significantly better hearing, but they do have fairly good eyesight as well. As mammals, of course, they're endotherms, like us, which means they're warm-blooded. They're able to generate their heat internally. They don't need outside sources like reptiles and amphibians. And they're nocturnal, so a little bit different from humans in that way. And they do have a few adaptations that help them when they're sleeping during the day. So when they're not active at night. So one of them is that they're able to hang upside down because they have a special tendon that helps them grip the surface of whatever they're hanging off of. So you can see that very well represented in the picture on the slide here. But they also have valves that prevent blood from accumulating in their head. So they're able to shut off these valves. So when they're hanging upside down, they don't get a blood rush to their head. So there are 18 different families of bats as well. So it can be very difficult to break it down into all the different levels of the genus and species and look at all of those. And even looking at the 18 different families is a lot as well. So I like to group them into based off of their diet. So I've grouped them into 5 different groups here based on their diet. And as an order, overall, as Chiroptera, they're viewed as omnivores, which means they'll eat both plants and animals. And they can generally fit into one of the following more specific categories. So frugivores is the name for animals that exclusively eat fruits. And so there is a few groups of bats that will only eat fruits, like the individual that's pictured on the slide here. There are also nectarivores, which are bats that feed exclusively on nectar of flowers, and they're really important pollinators for that reason as well. There are carnivores as well, such as vampire bats, and so these are individuals that will feed on other animals. And lastly, insectivores. So these are bats that will feed on insects exclusively. And this is the group that makes up most of our bat species across the world. So 70% of all of the bats species that exist are insectivores, and all of the species that are found in Ontario are insectivores as well. So all they eat is insects. So that's sort of a good breakdown into bats and their order Chiroptera. And next we'll get into some of those common misconceptions about bats. So one of the first ones that we've probably all heard is that all bats carry and will give you rabies. if you encounter them or if you touch them. And although bats can carry the disease, just like many other species of mammals as well, it's very unlikely that you'll actually contract rabies if you encounter a bat. That being said, I don't encourage anyone to go out and handle bats, and I don't encourage anyone to handle any wildlife unless absolutely necessary. If you just avoid handling wildlife in general, that will avoid any risks that might come with disease transfer. According to Toronto Public Health, it's estimated that only 2 to 3% of bats in Ontario are infected with rabies. So it's very, very unlikely that you will get rabies from them, especially if you avoid handling them. The next one that, again, I'm sure we've all heard is that vampire bats and carnivorous bats will suck human blood, which is not true. As we explored in the previous slide, most of our bats are, some of our bats are carnivores, but it's very unlikely that they'll go after humans. We sort of move and we're very loud, and it's a little bit hard for them to prey on us. So they'd much rather go after a larger mammal that's just standing around, like a cow or other member of livestock. And even though these vampire bats, of course, have to feed on mammals, it's very unlikely, and very often they do not end up harming or killing these animals because they'll only feed on a small amount of blood. And lastly, we've sort of talked about already as well, is that you're blind as a bat, bats are blind, also not true. So they have fairly good eyesight, but since they're well known for echolocation and using their ears to detect prey, many people have been led to believe that they have poor eyesight, but they actually have fairly good eyesight. And now on the topic of echolocation, we'll talk about it a bit further and sort of break down very briefly how it works. We won't go too high level into it. So all of our bats in Canada and in Ontario are insectivores and will use echolocation to detect their prey that's flying around, but not all bats have echolocation or will use this adaptation because they don't feed on insects that are flying around, and they'll feed on stationary objects like fruit that are on a tree. So not all bats actually have echolocation. But essentially how it works is bats will emit a high frequency sound called sonar. It's usually so high, it's undetectable to the human ear. There are specialized devices that have been created, technology out there that will detect it and identify species of bats. But generally, you're not going to hear it like you do a bird and be able to identify it. But they'll send this sound out into the night, and the sound will encounter items that are in the environment, generally insects, and then those sounds will be reverberated and rebound back towards the bat. So I really like the image that's at the bottom of the screen there as well. That sort of shows you the sound waves going out and returning. So they'll return to the bat's ears, and the bats are able to analyze the sounds, and they can determine the orientation of their prey item, the distance, how far away it is, the size, the texture, a number of things, just with this high frequency sound they put out. And that's how they're able to fly around and catch their prey, which is pretty cool. So I've got a question for you guys here now. So all across the world, there are 1,200 different species of bats that exist. So out of those 1,200, how many of those species do you think there are in Ontario? Any guesses on how many we have here? Alan suggested 4. We've got a few more than that, but that's a very good guess. Donna says 6, a little bit higher. Anyone else have a guess? There's 18 across Canada, but not all 18 of those are found here. Caroline suggested 5. It is more than 5. I'll take one more guess, see if you guys can get it. 9. Okay, one less than that. There's 8 different species of bats that are found here in Ontario, and they can be found in Muskoka as well. Unfortunately, half of the species that we have here in Ontario are at risk as well. So we'll talk about them over the next couple of slides, And you'll notice the species that are at risk, I put in brackets beside their name an EN for endangered. So all of the ones that are at risk in Ontario are listed as endangered as well. So if endangered, the next step would be extirpation of them not even being found in Ontario. You'll probably notice a trend, or at least I hope you guys will notice a trend and pattern between which ones are more at risk compared to the others. And so I'll see if you guys can figure out what that trend is by the end. Okay, so our Ontario bat species, we'll start off with the most common one that's found around Muskoka and around Ontario, and that's the big brown bat. A lot of the features are similar, as well as a lot of the habitats are similar amongst our Ontario species, but there are a few differences as well. So the big brown bat is one of our darker colored bats. They can be tan to dark brown in color. They're found in forested areas, and they'll roost under bark in hollow trees, rock crevices, and man-made structures. This is pretty common amongst all of our bat species, and roosting is basically where they're resting during the day when they're hanging upside down. They'll roost in colonies, so some will be in colonies of up to 700 bats, but there are some of our species that are solitary as well, the big brown bat being one of our definitely more social bats. And this is one of our species that will hibernate in caves and mines. The tricolored bat, which is one of our endangered species, is a brown yellow color in appearance overall, but each of their hairs is actually tricolored, so that's how they get their name. At the base of the hair, the color will be dark gray. In the middle, it'll be yellow, and then at the end, it's dark brown. So that's why they're like a brownish color, but some of that yellow mid color on the hair comes through as well. They're found in forested areas as well, but generally forested areas that are near to water. They'll roost in trees, caves, rock crevices, and buildings. And they're another species that will hibernate in caves and mines. So some of our other ones, which you'll see in the next slide, are migratory. So our next species is the hoary bat. So this is Canada's largest bat, 20 to 35 grams. I was looking for some comparisons before the presentation. And if you think of like a little packet of sugar that you'll see at a cafe or something, at a restaurant, that weighs 5 grams. So to reach the bottom of the scale, 20, you'd have 4 of those packs of sugar. That's how big they are. So not big, but that's their weight. So they're not very heavy. They're not very large, even for our largest bat. They have long, thick fur, and the fur on their back and tail is a brown-gray color with white tips. So you can definitely see that in their body in the photo that's on the screen here. But the fur on their head and throat is yellowish. So you can definitely see the difference between the color of their back and their head, and remaining fur on their body is black. They're found in densely forested habitats, and they'll roost in the tree foliage, generally on the edges of clearings. They're one of our more solitary species, and they are a migratory species that will fly down south in the wintertime. Our northern long-eared bat, also another one of our endangered species, is more of a dull yellow-brown color overall. They've got very large black ears, which can help you differentiate them from our other species. They're found in the boreal forest. They'll roost under tree bark and tree cavities and buildings. They're generally solitary as well, and they'll hibernate in our caves and mines too. Next is one of the cutest ones, in my opinion, with its nice red color, our eastern red bat. They're a yellow, red, orange, yellow color, some gray as well. They're found in forested areas, generally near grasslands and open areas, and they'll roost in dense tree foliage, and they're another one of the migratory species. The little brown bat is next, used to be one of the most common species in Ontario, but is now unfortunately listed as endangered. They have a glossy brown color all around. They're found in a wide range of habitats, which is why they used to be very common. And they'll roost in buildings, trees, wood piles, and caves. And they will hibernate as well, so they'll stick it out through the wintertime in caves and mines. Our last two species, the silver-haired bat. So they have thick black to dark brown fur, and the fur on the back has white tips, which gives it this nice shiny silvery appearance. They're found in forested areas as well, tending to be urban and rural. They'll roost under tree bark, and they're solitary and migratory. And lastly, our eastern small-footed bat, our last endangered one as well, which is the smallest Ontario bat, only 3 to 5 grams is how much they weigh. They have a glossy golden brown color. They have small feet compared to other species. So if you get close enough to take a look at their feet, you can tell the difference between them based on the size. They're found in forested areas that tend to be quite hilly, and they'll roost in hollow trees, under bark, in buildings, cliffs, and bridges. And they will hibernate over winter in caves and mines. So could anyone notice what the sort of trend was between our endangered species of bats? Any guesses? So Joanne said migratory, loss of habitat. Loss of habitat is one thing. And our hibernators are the ones that are more at risk. You guys are right. And so the main thing that is affecting our species that hibernate, and okay, gotcha, Joanne. Yep, our hibernators are so they're hibernating over the winter in caves and mines, and they're at risk due to habitat loss of caves and mines, as well as the white nose syndrome, which some of you may have heard of before, but we'll talk about when we get to our threats slide as well. So just one more slide before we get into our threats and things you can do to help. And so this is just some more facts that are common amongst all of our bat species. So I just wanted to include them all in one slide. So I'll talk a little bit more in depth about reproduction, as well as about hibernation. So in terms of reproduction, our Ontario bat species will actually mate in the fall, and they're able to store sperm for delayed fertilization. So they'll mate in the fall, but they won't fertilize their eggs until springtime, after they wake up from hibernation. The gestation period for most of our bats is between 50 to 60 days, but it can be shorter or longer. And it can be affected by a number of things, including environmental factors. So if we get a really bad spell of weather in April or early May, they may have a longer gestation period. So their young are being born when the weather's more suitable. But young bats are generally born in the summer, and many of our species will form maternity colonies where groups of females will all gather together in a warm, safe area, in a cave, to give birth and raise their young together, which is pretty nice. Usually there will be 1 to 2 pups, is what baby bats are called, which is very cute. So there will be 1 to 2 that are born, and they will nurse and nurture their young for about a month before they go off on their own to start their own bat lives. So that's a little bit about reproduction. In terms of hibernation, as we discussed, many of our species will hibernate. 5 of our species will hibernate in caves and mines, which are referred to as hibernacula. These areas must be cool and humid. They can't be drafty because that might wake them up. So they have to have really good conditions for them. Bats will reduce their body temperature to 3 to 6 degrees Celsius, and they'll lower their heart rate and metabolism so they're not using up all of their fat stores. And usually hibernation starts in October. So although it's nice to talk about bats at Halloween, most, like all of them, are hibernating now, or they've gone back south, and then they tend to wake back up around May. Okay. So that's a little bit more about them. And now we'll talk about some threats to bats and things that you can do to help. So as we've mentioned, 4 of the 8 species that are found in Ontario are endangered and at risk of becoming extirpated from the province. So I've highlighted here a few of their major threats to them. So one of them is pesticides. So as we've mentioned a few times as well, the primary source of food for a lot of our bats and all of our bats here in Ontario is flying insects. And unfortunately, many of our insects are viewed as pests and are deliberately or undeliberately affected by pesticides. Unfortunately, insects are one of the largest groups facing the most amount of decline, and they are the basis of the food chain as well. So they're the main source of food for a lot of our bats and our birds. And as we lose those species, lose those insects, our bats and birds and other animals that rely on insects, their populations will go down as well. And I always like to remind people that in reality, bats are the best pesticide for themselves, because that's what they'll eat, up to 600 insects in an hour sometimes. So unfortunately, that's one of the main things affecting them. Like many other animals, habitat loss is affecting them as well. So they rely on forested areas and dead trees for roosting and for habitat. And as these areas are cleared for development, they're losing that habitat that they need. They also rely on caves and old buildings, which can be a risk to humans as well. So a lot of old caves are being shut down, and mines, are being shut down, as well as old buildings are being torn down that they'd use as well. White nose syndrome, which of course is affecting our endangered species the most, is a deadly fungal disease that threatens them. So it's a fungus that grows in cold human environments, like caves, where they, hibernate and like to live. It was first noted in New York State in 2006, and millions of bats have died since then. What happens is it will damage their wing and skin tissue, but the biggest issue is that it will cause disruptions during their hibernation. So this makes the bats wake up, and they start depleting and using their fat reserves, because they need those to warm themselves up when they're awake. It may also cause them to leave their roosts and their hibernation areas sooner. So when weather is still cold outside and there's no food available for them, they often end up starving to death, unfortunately. And lastly, light pollution. It affects bats just like it affects a lot of our nocturnal species. They have certain adaptations that allow them to be active at night, and when there's lights everywhere, especially during migration time as well, it can negatively impact our nocturnal species. So thankfully, there are some things we can do to help as well. So one thing is avoiding the use of pesticides and encouraging your neighbors and friends to avoid using pesticides when they can as well. You can leave standing dead trees on your property if you're able to, if they're not a threat to falling on your house or something like that. You can leave them up as potential habitat for bats and other species. You can put up a bat box too. There's a lot of resources online. If you do a quick search, you can find out the certain diameters to build one yourself, or I think they sell kits places as well. But these help provide more areas for them to roost and live. You can turn out lights, and that will help reduce the overall light pollution as well. And another thing I'd like to encourage as well is if you see a bat and you're able to take a picture or you're able to identify it, you can report it to different citizen science networks as well, such as iNaturalist, if anyone is familiar with using that. So although there are many threats to bats, there are some things that we can do to help, and hopefully if we all take some steps towards helping our species that are in decline, it will make a difference. Get to the next slide. Okay, so lastly, our cool bats and cool facts. So I've got a few random things that I learned during my research for these presentations. So our first one is that the Townsend's bat, which is pictured in the top corner there, is able to emit sound from its nose during echolocation. So where most of our species just emit sound through their mouth, these ones are able to emit sound through their nose, and they're one of the only ones that can do that, which is really interesting. This is a species that's found mostly in Mexico and the United States, but it is also found in southern BC, so it's one of our Canadian species as well, which is pretty cool. Next is that bats are very, very hungry little critters. They can actually eat the equivalent of their entire body weight in insects in just one night. So they are definitely very good insect control, which is my next fun fact, that they're really important, helping to control pest insect species. And of course, they also help with pollination, not necessarily here in Ontario, but some of our nectivore bats in other parts of the world are really important pollinators as well. Next one is another reason why they're important. They can actually be used for their feces or guano, which is a really great soil fertilizer. So it contains powerful decomposing microbes, which actually help to control soil-borne diseases and harmful nematodes that will attack plants. So they serve as ideal compost activators, and they can speed up the decomposition process as well. My next one is about the largest bat in the world, which is the golden crowned flying fox, also pictured here as well. So it's one of the largest species of bats in the world. There was a bit of debate for which was the largest, but their wingspan is 5 feet 6 inches, so significantly taller than I am, which is just terrifying to think about, but also very, very cool. And they weigh 2.6 pounds, so they are quite large bats. And my last fun fact is that bats are actually really, really fast too. So they can reach speeds of up to 95 kilometers an hour, some of the species. Very, very cool. Bats and very cool facts. And so that actually brings us to the end of our presentation today. So if you guys have any questions, or if you want to share any stories that you have about encounters with bats, feel free to put them in the comments or unmute yourselves. I've also got my information here if you ever have any other questions, or if you see a bat and you want to ask what species it is, you can always send me a picture to my email or give me a call. So I'll hang around for a little bit for any questions. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for joining me for our All About Bats webinar this Halloween. So Donna, oh, let me make this bigger so I can see everyone's. So Donna said that they've had 2 bat houses for a few years, but no bats that go into the houses. Any suggestions for that? So I'm not a bat expert by any means. I did a lot of research for the presentation, but I may not have all the answers for you guys. But one of the things I'd suggest is that it might just be the location isn't in a preferred area for the bats. If it's an area that you're walking by really often, or you're making a lot of noise by, it might just not be too suitable to them if it's too close to the house. So maybe putting it a little bit further from the house could help if that might be the issue. Pam said, what is the status of white nose? I'm not too sure on the status. It is still prevalent and occurring. I don't know if it's increasing or declining at this point. There is a lot more research that's going towards bats now, since they are increasingly at risk. So I haven't spent too much time looking into it, so I don't know for sure. But I can look into it a bit more and get back to you on that. On if it's increased, like if it's becoming more prevalent or if it's in decline. But as far as I know, it's still the #1 issue for our bats. Someone asked where the migrating bats go to, and I had a feeling I was going to get this question, and I remember seeing it during my research, but can't remember exactly where they go to exactly. But of course, just a general, more southern area, either the southern states or Central America. but I don't know the exact location. Joanne had the same issue that Donna mentioned, having bat houses, but not having any bats at them. But same answer to that. Try a different location. It might just be that they don't enjoy the area that it's at now. Thanks, Alan, for attending. Where to install? I haven't looked up the exact information, like for specifics where they should be installed. So I definitely encourage that you look into it, because I imagine there's some information online that says a preferred height. I'm sure there's specific height from the ground where they prefer to roost, and that would be the best height for where to put your boxes. Again, further away from where there's a lot of activity, because they probably don't love that too much. Those are my best suggestions right now, but there should be some more information online for sure. Linda said that she doesn't see bats in the evening, but the trail camera gets photos of them. That's really interesting. We have some trail cameras set up at a number of our properties as well that we're protecting, but I haven't seen any bats on them yet. But I hope to at some point, like you are. That's very cool. Awesome. Lots of good questions there. If you have any more, feel free to give me a call or send me an email, and I'd be happy to answer them and look into things a bit more as well. But thank you guys again so much for joining. I'll stick around again if any other questions pop up. But feel free to go if you don't have any other questions. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone.